Today I'd like to discuss an experiment which occurred in 1972 which explores the relationship between an experience of punishment in infancy and an experience of the same punishment in adulthood. From this study, we might glean some information about how punishment in childhood is likely to affect or modify behaviour as an adult. The title of the paper is Reactions to Punishment Determined by Infant Experience with Aversive Stimulation by Ernest Abel and Gary Walters of the University of Toronto. Previous research by V.H. Denenberg in 1964 had indicated that if pre-weanling animals were exposed to aversive stimulation in infancy, they would have decreased fearfulness to noxious stimuli in adulthood. This led to the general hypothesis, as quoted by Levine and Mullins in 1968, that exposing an animal to stress early in ontogenesis reduced its emotional response to subsequent stressful situations. Abel and Walters noted, however, that much of the research was conducted in an avoidance paradigm. So they set about testing the generality of the relationship between aversive stimulation in infancy and again in adulthood, ensuring that the shock was self-inflicted by the animal. The participants in this study were 32 Long Evans hooded rats born and raised at the University of Toronto. At 15 days of age, they are assigned randomly, without regard to sex, to one of the following conditions: A. Handling, B. Shock only, C. Handling plus shock, D. No handling, no shock control group. Handling in all circumstances involved being held in the palm of the hand by the experimenter for 3 minutes. Shock in all circumstances involved being shocked once to each rat's foot and tail for 1 second at 1 milliampere. Following this process, the rats were left undisturbed for 6 months. Before the second part of the experiment, the rats were deprived of food and reduced to about 80% of their normal body weight, before being trained to press a lever to receive a pellet of food. Following training, they were given a 20-minute session in the Grassen-Stadler rat chamber for 7 consecutive days, where each lever press resulted in 1 pellet of food. On the day after the last training session, each animal was given a shock with each lever press, as well as food. 10 consecutive punishment sessions were given. The day after the last punishment session, shock was discontinued and lever pressing was rewarded with a pellet of food over a 5-day period of extinction. The difference between pre-punishment and punishment phases were evaluated using the animal as its own baseline of control. This analysis indicated a significant infant shock effect. The analysis of the difference between pre-punishment and post-punishment data indicated no infant shock effects, but a significant effect of infant handling. All subjects showed immediate recovery of pre-punishment baselines upon termination of punishment, except the handled shocked animals who decreased responding. Abel and Walters' results were consistent with previous research, such as by Hunt and Otis in 1963, and indicate that infant experience with shock has an effect on the animal into adulthood. However, their results also lay in direct contrast to other studies, such as those of Kurtz and Walters in 1962 and Rashland in 1966, where the animals were first shocked in adulthood. In those studies, prior shock was shown to increase the suppressive power of shock in subsequent testing, rather than decrease it, as the present study found. Whether or not the age of the rat during first shock may change these results awaited investigation in 1972. But that information might tell us more about the effects of age of punishment on adult behaviour. So the topic was, is punishment an effective behaviour modification strategy in children? The results of this study may give us some indication of how punishment of an infant might modify its behaviour if we generalise these results across to humans, in which case we might infer that children will respond to a stimulus less in the presence of a punishment, but will also possibly have their punishment threshold increased in adulthood when presented with the same. Such an inference might lead us to conclude that punishment is effective as a behaviour modification strategy in an immediate sense, but the long-term effect may be that the person becomes desensitised to the punishment as an adult. Of course, an alternative interpretation of the results may be that the 6-month period between initial shock and later shock in the rat is not a sufficient amount of time to justify the inference that in humans a shock in infancy might have the same effect some 18 years later in adulthood. To generalise from rats to humans also, of course, is fraught with controversy because humans are rats and rats are different on a number of levels, most specifically their levels of intelligence, their levels of insight and their own species-specific behaviour. In terms of the experiment's methodology and design, we might criticise a number of points. A small sample size of only 24 rats bred in the laboratory might not be truly representative of the broader rat population, born and raised in different circumstances. Indeed, the surprising results that handling alone had a significant effect on the rats' responses is illustrative of the fact that a small variable in the style of rearing could have a significant impact on behaviour. Variables such as gender and size should have been made explicit in the study to account for individual differences. And also, because the rats have been deprived of food, the hunger drive should have been taken into account when analysing the results. On the other hand, the experiment has some great strengths. It isolates the variables really well by applying exactly the same living conditions to the rats from birth and using sophisticated apparatus which severely limits the animal's responses, making the data fairly reliable. The researchers ensured that punishment was self-inflicted to account for any instrumental learning the rats may gain in an avoidance paradigm. Overall, in the context of a wide variety of similar studies performed in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly, it is reasonable to infer that punishment of a person in their infancy will significantly affect their responses during the punishment period and also long after extinction into adult life.